Michael, welcome back. Always a pleasure to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
All right, a lot to get to because I want to talk censorship EU, some stuff that came out from Tulsi Gabbard. But there's a piece that you wrote that I want to just, or pushed out that I think was interesting. You wrote Gavin Newsom's presidential ambitions, Soros money, progressive dogma behind the insanity-driven murder of Rob Reiner. I was
Yes.
like, okay, tell me more.
Yeah, well, so a lot of people may know the broad outlines of the story, but Nick Reiner is the son of the great Hollywood filmmaker Rob Reiner. I mean, it's shocking how many good films Rob Reiner made. If you're not remember it, I mean, it's A Few Good Men, it's Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally. I mean, like multiple classics. So truly one of America's great filmmakers. The attention given to his murder by his son is worthwhile because it's a huge story. Plus, it has, I think, significant public policy and political implications. So, to kind of provide some context here, Gavin Newsom in 2020, January 2020, he had been in office for a year. He was elected 2018. Gives the State of the State address, which is like our State of the Union address, and it was amazing. I mean, I basically, and I'm one of the biggest critics of Gavin Newsom, I basically agreed with like all of it, almost all of it. And he called for basically what every civilized country in the world does, which is it allows for courts working with families to mandate treatment of people with serious mental illness like schizophrenia. There's also similar programs for people with, addictions that they just can't quit in order to get them the help that they need. Often it's tied to when they commit a crime, but there's much more latitude than we have here. And Newsom proposed changing the laws specifically to get people off the street for homelessness. Nick Reiner was on the street sometimes, but I think a lot of times he was at his folks' house. But I mean, here was the guy that was in and out of rehab 18 times. There's no question that he broke multiple laws, including, open air drug use, is likely camping outside, all sorts of things that could have gotten him the intervention that addicts need in order to recover from their addiction. And he couldn't get that because Gavin Newsom never followed through on his promises. And the reason he didn't do that is because he made it very clear he needed George Soros's money to, be reelected, to resist a recall, to recently just passed this terrible gerrymandering legislation that carved up California in a million little pieces or a million strange pieces to prevent, to reduce the few number of Republicans the state sends to Congress already. And I just point out that, this is a tragedy that almost certainly could have been prevented had Nick Reiner been under some court-ordered mandate to take his meds, and I had some pushback on social media where people are like, oh, that's terrible authoritarianism or something. I mean, this is the standard of treatment in every developed country in the world: Japan, Germany, France, the Netherlands, country I studied more closely. So I think it's wrong to just look at it as sort of an inevitable tragedy or just sort of moral depravity. I mean, the guy probably had people are describing him having kind of a poor character, but also that's pretty typical of people with schizophrenia. There's a very difficult mental illness. And I just think that, there's blood on Gavin Newsom's hands. I just don't think we can sugarcoat it. He should have done what he promised to do in 2020. And instead he went for the Soros bucks, and that's where he's remained. I mean, he even opposed legislation that would have cracked down on fentanyl drug dealing last November as Prop 36. It passed with 68% of the vote. Newsom opposed it, and now he's not funding its enforcement. So, speaking of bad characters, we have one as our governor here in California.
I'm looking at this tweet that you put out. You said many view Nick Reiner's apparent murder of his father, Rob Reiner, and his mother as an unavoidable tragedy. In truth, had Gavin Newsom done what he had promised to do in 2020 and mandated treatment of addicts and the mentally ill, Rob and Michelle would likely be alive today. The reason Newsom broke his promise is because he cares more about George Soros's money than he does about preventing mentally ill addicts from killing their parents. But what I want you to explain to people is that Soros connection. Why does George Soros oppose this? And how much money is he given to why would he stand in the way of this?
Yeah, I mean, look, a lot of conspiracy theories out there about George Soros. I mean, important for people to understand, he was the largest political donor in 2022, one of the largest in 2024, longtime Democratic Party donor, maybe the largest over the last 30 years, going back to the Clintons. His motivation, I think, is more maybe ideological or and mundane than a lot of people would like it to be. I don't think he's deliberately trying to destroy civilization. In fact, I think he's emblematic of what was called, or what is called, the Open Society Consensus, named after, after World War II. This idea that in order to prevent totalitarianism, either communism or fascism, from returning, so the United States doesn't have to fight any more foreign wars, also as the paradigm for expanding global markets and liberalism. Very good idea in 1945, but that logic of an open society led Soros, or leads Soros, to basically have invested in effectively wanting open borders. I mean, I did work for Soros in the 90s when I was on the far left, and one of his staffers told me that they were basically in favor of open borders, in favor of drug legalization. I think in part, I was told, including by Soros's top person on drugs, at least in the past, that he was just libertarian. I think that Soros enjoyed marijuana. That was my understanding. Maybe other drugs, but felt like they should be legal. Didn't think there should be any obstacle to them. And he has funded, I mean, it is incredible what one billionaire can do over a 30-year period. Funded, radical left district attorneys, decriminalized, drug use, drug dealing, California. I mean, the initiative I mentioned that passed last November is recent. They had spent decades decriminalizing, even hard drugs in California. And this is part of Soros's, ideology, and it's sort of a radical version of what was the mainstream post-war globalist open society ideology that, President Trump and populists around the world are now, in a backlash against, for precisely the reasons that, I'm describing, which is that, all societies rest on a set of conservative values. I mean, liberal societies require that, that you have families and norms and values that, and some amount of legal and laws that allow us to take care of loved ones who, have gone mentally ill. And, Soros just doesn't have that in his register. He doesn't have that part of it. He and his people and the people he's been funding, and now he's very old, so it's in the hands of his son. But nonetheless, that, Soros and his Open Society Foundations just committed to a very radical liberalization, including ones that basically allow very mentally very sick people to, cause violence to themselves and others.
But what I'm missing, and again, I just need you to explain this, is that, like, I get everything you just said about Soros. He's for open borders. He doesn't want drugs to be legalized. Fine. But the legislation that you were describing that Gavin Newsom initially backed in that state of the state that you talked about, at least as far as my very, very cursory read of this, is about getting them help, not punishing them. So if you're Soros, is that contradictory to what you're, like, just because you want it legalized, the help that someone like Nick Reiner could have gotten isn't necessarily in direct contradiction to what it seems that you described Soros's beliefs are?
Yeah, great. I'm glad you're probing on that issue. It's important to get at. Yeah, I mean, he does oppose that legislation. It's basically, in the 90s, there was a bunch of cases of people with schizophrenia that committed homicides when they were off their meds. California passed a law called Laura's Law. New York passed a law called Kendra's Law. I think there's a lot of laws like that. People, we all know the classic case, people with schizophrenia that push people onto subway tracks, or, or just murder people in a variety of ways. So legislation was passed in the early 2000s, Laura's Law in 2002, that would just have a court order that you have to take your meds. Because going off your meds makes you psychotic in ways that being on methamphetamine makes, addicts. They're against it. ACLU's against it. They manipulate people's emotions by talking about Britney Spears, who also would benefit from some sort of court-ordered, psychiatric care. But they say bodily autonomy, Sean. That's the mantra they repeat: bodily autonomy, bodily autonomy. Well, when you're psychotic, like Nick Reiner appears to have been, he had no bodily autonomy. He he slashed his parents' throats. I mean, he was out of control the night before, and they almost called 911 on him apparently at that party with Conan O'Brien and Bill Hader, and they should have called 911. They should have had Nick Reiner should have been in a 3-day hold, and then he should have had a court order mandate because, like you point out here, he's going to be in prison, probably a prison for the criminally insane, for the rest of his life, and 2 people are dead. A smaller restriction of his freedom beforehand would have prevented this tragedy and much worse impositions on his bodily autonomy than he'll have now.
All right, guys, right now, Beam is giving my listeners the ultimate Patriot discount, 40% off. If you've been wondering how I sleep so well at night, Beam's Dream Powder is the answer. Go to shopbeam.com, use code SPICER at checkout, shopbeam.com/SPICER, all natural ingredients, reishi, melatonin, L-theanine, magnesium. You're going to love it. Amazing flavor. Shopbeam.com/SPICER, use code SPICER. Before I move on, there was also reporting. I mean, I get it, because that this is about forcing somebody to take a drug and put it in their body. Okay, interesting. Yeah. But there was also reporting that like the doctor changed his meds and how much that had. Is that just random, or is there something that drove that?
We don't know the details of that. And I mentioned in the piece that, maybe something will come up that would alter the basic story, but I don't think so, in the sense that, schizophrenia is a very difficult mental illness to treat in general, but France, Germany, Netherlands, basically everybody does a better job than we do. If you're treating it over, he's 32, so let's say he was diagnosed when he was 20. That's sort of the typical presentation. Men a little bit earlier than women. He should have been on a very, good regime for a very long time. But that also then required that he not use hard drugs. This is a very important part of it, is that the violence that you get from people with schizophrenia often comes when they use hard drugs, because the hard drugs make them psychotic, right? They're taking antipsychotics. So you're literally seeing, it's probably, somewhere around 5 to 10% of our homeless, they're self-medicating. They feel better using crack and heroin and fentanyl. I mean, but those are precisely the drugs that they should not be allowed to use. So if he had a schizophrenia diagnosis and was ever going to rehab, absolutely. That meant that he was, breaking the law. That would have been the opportunity to get him the care he needed. It's certainly conceivable that somebody already under court ordered mandated care, could use hard drugs and have this kind of an aberration. But again, Sean, he went to rehab 18 times. That was 18 separate failures before you got to this one. And I'll just say one final thing before, people may remember that there was this Ukrainian refugee, Irina Zarutska, who was murdered brutally with a guy stabbed her in the neck earlier this year. That guy had schizophrenia and had been arrested, I believe, over 12 times. So it's like, what are we doing here, guys? Like, America needs a wake-up call. We have a serious untreated mental illness crisis that's resulting in murders. I mean, just awful, awful homicides that I'm not saying they never, ever happen in other countries, but they happen a lot less because we do not do what we know we need to do, and what basically every psychiatrist will agree needs to happen, which is mandated care that also really makes strong efforts to make sure people do not use illegal drugs, and if they do, there's consequences.
All right, I want to move into the Shellenberger wheelhouse. You have been a big-time advocate, champion of free speech, and you were just over in Europe. And the funny thing is, a lot of people probably glaze over when we say EU censorship, like, why do I care? But I care because I'm concerned that that's going to become an export of the EU to the United States. So let's just start with this. You addressed the EU Parliament about the policies that are leading to censorship and, frankly, criminalization of speech. Let's just talk. Give me the Cliff Note version of the Shellenberger presentation to the EU Parliament.
Sure, and hopefully I'll release it soon. They're taking their time to get the video done, but just to back.
Wait, by the way, there is a little bit of irony in that they're sort of taking the time and slow walking your speech about censorship. But
no, yeah, I mean, I'm not. It's just more bureaucracy probably than. I opened by just pointing out. Let's remember this incident during COVID. Harvard medical professor Martin Kildorf was asked, does everybody need to take the vaccine, the COVID vax? And is there natural immunity? And he said, not everybody needs to take the vaccine. Kids don't need to take it. And if you've already had COVID, you have natural immunity. Well, Twitter, at the behest of censorship activists at Stanford, censored his tweet. It's crazy. Natural immunity we've known since the Athens plague of 450, because Thucydides wrote about it. Everybody knows about natural immunity. And during COVID, people treated that like misinformation, precisely because they thought, oh, it might discourage people from getting the vaccine. So they were censoring accurate information. That's important to know. And also, like, what, you can't have an opinion about who gets the vaccine. And this is the Harvard medical professor. So I give that example to say that is the stuff that's getting censored. They want to censor accurate information. Look, even if they wanted to censor inaccurate information, it's still illegal. I mean, people are allowed to be wrong on the internet. I mean, as you know, that happens quite a bit. So imagine the government's involved in that. Why should Americans care? Well, because they want to censor you. I mean, let's be clear. Like, just a couple of weeks ago, the EU announced that they wanted to fine Elon Musk 140 million euros. They're going after Elon Musk's X precisely because it's the freest social media platform. You got to remember, this is last year, the head of censorship for the European Union sent Elon a letter threatening him because he was planning to interview Donald Trump on a Spaces podcast. He was happily fired after that because it clearly overstepped his grounds. But the EU is absolutely dying to censor Americans. And they're working. I reported a few weeks ago, there was a meeting in September, Sean, at Stanford. They won't let it go, with EU officials, Australian officials, Brazilian officials, all working together, and Americans, to basically have a coordinated global strategy. They're looking to encircle the United States, so that if they get at every major developed country in the world to censor speech they don't like, that creates the wrong narratives and promotes the wrong behaviors, then they're hoping that the social media platforms will just find it easier to use that censorship standard domestically on Americans. Plus, of course, they want to censor Americans around the world. So it has to be understood in the context of the fact that European leaders are like the least popular people in the world. Macron, the head of France, has a 15% approval rating. The head of Germany, Merz, has a 20% approval rating. Prime Minister of Britain has a 25% approval rating. He's not in the EU, but the UK is doing the worst censorship of all. So as far as I'm concerned, we are in an absolute free speech crisis. President Trump has defunded a lot of the bad censorship stuff that was happening under Biden. But nonetheless, this is an imminent present threat to America's free speech coming straight from Europe, and they just won't let it go. They're absolutely desperate to impose very dangerous, strict levels of censorship on all of us.
This isn't setting off alarm bells. Because I think that's the point of this conversation, is to understand, folks, this is coming to our shores, and what Michael is explaining is that there's a plan. So I want to ask you two quick questions before I get to the next, to the extent you know this. If I'm an American and I go over to the UK, I'm going to take a trip, but I've said a bunch of stuff on Twitter, who cares about COVID or whatever. Could I get arrested over there because I said something and posted it in America, but it was obviously for the world to see?
Great question. Who knows? I mean, legally, you are bound by the laws of the country you're in. Like, we don't go to other countries and say, oh, we don't have that law in the United States. You have to follow the laws of the foreign countries you're in. So, yeah, if you tweet something, I'm assuming in that country, you would be much more at risk than you would if you had tweeted it at home. But we saw a British gentleman, Grant Linham, who is a real hero, actually, on the gender madness issue. He was arrested at the airport when he returned from the United States for posts that he had tweeted or put on X when he was in the U.S. I mean, that is really disturbing. I mean, I think it shows. And there's, by the way, 30 people arrested per day in the UK. When I first heard that statistic, I was sure it was wrong. I mean, that is the actual number. 30 people a day arrested by UK police for things that they say online. This is the country that created the whole idea of free speech. I mean, it was, English Americans that got the idea of free speech. That's why we made it the First Amendment, because they didn't want to have to keep asking the king for permission about what they could say. So no, it's an absolute look. It's a free speech emergency. I wish it were getting more attention here in the United States. We've got to do more about it. I mean, the president has. There's been some threats. JD Vance gave a speech in Munich earlier this year. We need the Trump administration to just demand, free speech standards for American companies. I mean, they're going after Elon Musk here, guys. This is very serious business. The Brazilian government froze Elon Musk's Starlink assets because he refused to censor. So they're not playing around. They view censorship as a must-have because they know that if they can't censor, for example, criticisms of mass migration, which really only X has drawn attention to, the media there which are funded by the governments, engaged in mass censorship and disinformation on mass migration. Without X, Europe really doesn't have free speech at all. So I think this is it should be a number one issue for the president and the vice president.
You mentioned the vice president's speech in Munich, and he got a lot of pushback and blowback from like legacy folks for calling out what they're doing. When you address Parliament, when you talk to folks over there, do they deny that they're doing this? In other words, are they saying, Michael, this is crazy. This is not what we're really doing. We're just protecting people. In other words, do they admit that is it like we're censoring people, but it's for the greater good? Or do they just all out deny that that's even what they're doing?
Yeah, they do. They deny, they say it's not censorship. We're just fighting misinformation for the greater good. Yeah, I mean, calling it censorship alone is essential, right? I mean, remember how we were all sucked up into this in 2016 after Trump was elected? Oh, it was all this misinformation online. Everyone was kind of sucked up into it, actually. People on the left and the right. Oh, we have to do more to fight this foreign misinformation. I mean, it was part of the Russiagate hoax. It's counter-populism. I mean, to be really clear about it, like the censorship is in service of preventing populists from coming to power and changing the things that President Trump has changed, whether it's on, climate change, really mass migration is kind of the big one. And that's really what they're after. And so, I should say there's obviously the Europeans, they disagree. So there's not a single European. I mean, the Europeans, that are for free speech absolutely loved the JD Vance speech. And, we can talk more about it, but they see the censorship as sort of a single part of basically the establishment blob's counter-populism, an attempt for them to stay in power and fend off these, policy revisions to what's basically been the EU, the open society consensus since World War II.
So if it wasn't for JD Vance's speech in Munich and your fabulous writing at public.news, like where you calling it out, I don't know that someone like me would even know this, right? Meaning I try to be politically attuned. And yet, if it wasn't for what you do, your writings, JD's speech. So I guess the question I have for you is like twofold. When did all this happen? Like, because if it wasn't for you, I feel like one day I'd wake up and be like, holy smokes, like this is done. And like, what is happening politically that's sort of allowing this to happen? Like, why aren't there more outrage and within Europe?
Yeah, so I mean, it goes back at least over a decade. There was a little bit of these demands to do censorship before the populist revolts of 2016. There was this Christchurch killing, you may remember, I believe it was 2014. At that point, a bunch of governments got together and said, hey, we need to impose censorship on social media to prevent, hatred and violence. Then 2016 happens, and you see the intelligence community intermediaries like the Atlantic Council, the Stanford Internet Observatory pop up, Graphica, the University of Washington gets a researchers. You start to see these so-called misinformation researchers that show up, and every country does it the same, which is that and this is what Europe is moving towards right now, and is what we were trying, but basically Democrats were trying to put in place after 2016, first through sort of hiding stuff inside the Department of Homeland Security. And then after Biden was elected, it was like gloves off, and the White House was participating in it. But the central censorship strategy that everybody has to understand is that governments want to choose a set of academics or think tanks with clear and sometimes obvious relationships to the intelligence community to identify whole narratives such as not everybody needs to get the vaccine, or natural immunity is real. If you've had COVID, you don't need the vaccine. They want to censor whole narratives, including true information, and that is what they did on COVID. They also did it on other things like elections. They've done it on climate change, transgenderism, but particular and migration is a huge one. So the governments they try to pretend that they're not the ones engaged in the censorship, and they basically are, but they're basically choosing the NGOs or the academics to act as what they call trusted flaggers. That's the language everyone should be aware of. They did that in the United States. They're doing that in Europe. And the whole idea, and it all happens in secret. So you basically, this is anathema to the whole idea of free speech, which is that you're allowing special committees of individual, frankly, political activists that are completely ideologically driven to behind the scenes tell the internet companies what they need to be censoring, all with the government, permission. And basically in the United States, it was Department of Homeland Security that was sort of there authorizing it. In Europe, obviously, it's the European Union. In Europe, they're calling it the democracy shield. They want to shield democracy from misinformation. That's their story. In fact, they're trying to shield themselves from democracy and free speech. But all of that really kicks into gear after 2016, clearly as the measures of counter populism, and they worked through, intelligence agencies, the center left, but also center right parties in Britain. The news media, it's just awful. The Telegraph has been good, but both the New York Times, the Times of London have basically made the case for this form of censorship. And a lot of these news media companies I mentioned in Europe are funded by the governments, and they want to play that role of being the so-called fact checkers and deciding what the truth is, and censoring folks like you and me and everybody else online, and deciding what we can and cannot say.
Unbelievable. Tangentially, there's an issue that came up when Tulsi Gabbard spoke to the Turning Point USA crowd. Let me just play you a clip from this.
But what I've seen over these months is that every time they make progress and they move closer and closer to that hope for peace, the warmongers in the deep state step up and try to do everything they can to stop them. Predictably, they use the same old tactics that they've always used. The deep state within the intelligence community weaponizes intelligence to try to undermine progress. They leak it to their friends in the mainstream propaganda media to try to spread this and push a false narrative. They foment fear and hysteria as a way to justify the continuing of the war and their efforts to undermine President Trump's efforts towards peace. And do so specifically in this case in order to try to pull the U.S. military into a direct conflict with Russia, which is ultimately what the EU and NATO want.
Okay, Michael, you heard that last line there. Tulsi Gabbard saying that the EU and NATO actually want a war with Ukraine, want us to go after Russia in defense of Ukraine. That's a pretty big allegation.
Hey, this is the biggest underreported story in the world right now. You have the Director of National Intelligence, a position that was created after 9/11 to basically run the entire intelligence community. She is supposed to outrank the Director of Central Intelligence. She's saying there's forces within the U.S. government and the European government and NATO that are trying to undermine peace between Russia and Ukraine. That's extremely serious. I've been reporting, and others have too, that the Trump administration does not have full control over the intelligence community. There remain, particularly the CIA, has not been cleaned out, but I think there's questions raised about the FBI as well. There hasn't been a house cleaning. And yeah, her allegations are extremely serious. She also on X criticized a Reuters piece that she said was inaccurate, that was suggesting that Russia had these designs to invade Europe. In Europe, what I heard in Strasbourg, which is where the European Parliament sometimes is when it's not in Brussels, it was widely understood that that really Merz and Macron in particular, but also Ursula von der Leyen, who runs the European Commission, that they also are actively sabotaging peace, including the peace efforts by the Trump administration, because they want to continue the war, and they want to continue the war because that's they need an external enemy because they're so unpopular. It's also a huge source of revenue to their cronies. That's why the people would say that's why they're always meeting with Zelensky, because he's so much more popular than they are. So this is an extremely serious allegation by the Director of National Intelligence. There should be a lot more reporting and I think commentary about it, because ending this war in Ukraine has just got to be priority number one for American foreign policy. It's just gone on too long. We don't have I think most people now agree, the United States does not have a strategic national security interest in Ukraine. It's time for the Europeans to step up. If they want to keep fighting that war, they need to do so separate from us. And I think that's why you start to see people like Massey and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Representative Luna and others start to raise the question of why are we still in NATO? My view is that NATO requires that all of the members be democracies with free speech. They are violating that actively. If they're not going to abide by NATO rules, then we shouldn't be in NATO.
100%. This is so mind-blowing. I mean, they're violating NATO's principles because of the democracy piece, but what you just said about Tulsi, she literally sitting there in a public forum on a stage calling this out and saying, I'm with you. I cannot believe no one said, hey, the woman who knows everything, has all the secrets, is saying, A, we're being undermined in our own country, and two, the EU and NATO countries really want the war to go on. I hope it does get more attention. Michael, I got to thank you for, as always, for coming on the show, exposing stuff, and all the great work you guys do at Public to really ring the bell about free speech. I am so honored that you come on our show, but also, again, I just thank you for what you guys do, because we wouldn't know about a lot of this stuff if it wasn't for the great work that you guys do at public.news. So thank you, and I appreciate you being with us.
Great to be with you, Sean.
You bet.
Well, if you enjoyed this content, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and click the notification bell to get more.